Hi everyone! So today we're going to talk about the First World War with Dr Simon Peaple, based on an article in The Guardian from 2014 where they reported Nigel Farage arguing that the Versailles Treaty was a mistake. And that reportedly he said that had the Entente powers continued the advance, Hitler would never have been able to get off the ground. So I'm inviting Dr Simon Peaple back to explore the quotes reported in The Guardian more fully and see what he thinks. I've been unable to find a primary source for this, so I could share the full lecture with you and give you as much full context, but we'll work with what we can for now. See you all soon. Hello and welcome back to the programme.
Hi, thank you for having me back.
Explaining the consensus about the Versailles Treaty being a mistake, saying, but I don't think the Versailles Treaty was a mistake. I believe the real mistake, the anniversary which we remember today, was the Armistice, with him reportedly saying that had we driven the German army completely out of France and Belgium and forced them into an unconditional surrender, Herr Hitler would never have got his political army off the ground. He couldn't have claimed that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians in Berlin, or that Germany had never been defeated in the field. So, as a historian of the First World War, what would be your thoughts?
Well, I think, like a lot of counterfactual arguments, it has some truth. I mean, clearly the stab in the back myth would have been more difficult if there had been a full-blown unconditional surrender in the same way that there was in 1945. But that wouldn't necessarily have stopped people blaming the defeat upon a political stab in the back. And then it also ignores the impact of quite a lot of other factors as well. So I think, like a lot of these things, it's a convenient truth to make a charge that there is a different way of looking at things. But on the other hand, there are a lot of issues that you'd have to go into to take that statement and break it down. So, I mean, the first one would be if we'd gone in. Now, that betrays a lack of understanding of where Britain was at in October, November 1918, when the decision was made to settle for an armistice. The first and key thing to remember is that by let's say October, because the moves towards the armistice began at that point. By October of 1918, Britain had lost nearly the 1 million men it was to lose in the whole of the war. It had mobilised the best part of 8 million men, of whom over 5 million had served in the army. And those men were running short in supply. The 1917 offensive at Passchendaele had proved disastrously expensive in manpower. There can be some debate as to whether the decision by Lloyd George and the cabinet to restrict the numbers of men going over to France in early 1918 contributed to the problems of March 1918. But nonetheless, manpower was in short supply. That is not doubted. How you dealt with that, how you work round it, can be debated. But the actual real fact was that manpower was in great shortage. So the standard answer to that, of course, is, well, the Americans had arrived. But the build-up of American troops had actually had to be slowed for two reasons. The first was that the shipping needed to bring the troops over was also needed to bring over raw materials, key foodstuffs, and that the priority had to be given to those things. So that's the first thing. Brutal truth. Had we been able to get the supplies over and the troops over, that was different. Big impact of the submarine warfare in 1917 was that the shipping losses meant that we had to find a way to prioritise more than we had before. So because the French coal and iron mines had been occupied by the Germans, the British were producing a lot of the steel that the French were then using, either to continue manufacture, or where they couldn't continue manufacture, British manufacturing was supplying the finished product. So you couldn't rush huge numbers of American troops over because you needed the space on the ships. The second thing that caused this issue with the American manpower was that the American manpower had been husbanded by the American commander Pershing under orders from his government. And that was because they were concerned to be fed into the line under the command of the British and French generals. Particularly, it was felt that the British generals, who might be the natural option because of the language, would be careless about casualties. They were seen as having been careless so far, so why would you put all your men under their command? Secondly, the American High Command completely failed to understand how much they needed to learn. So there was a feeling that the British and the French had lost huge numbers of men. They clearly weren't that good at the job, and therefore what was needed now was American organisation, American power, and actually that left out the huge amount of learning that had gone on. So, for example, the detail that went into staff work. American staff work was not very good. Some officers had gone on secondment to British units, because obviously that wasn't like deploying the men. So senior staff officers for a division would be attached to a British or French division and see how it worked. The difficulty was that that was a slow process. Just as the British Army had had to build up a body of competent staff officers in 1914 through to 16, that process took time. More time for the British than the Americans, because the British had to do the fighting at the same time, and you know, people got promoted and moved around. For operational needs, you couldn't just concentrate on developing staff men. But the Americans underestimated that. And if you look at their performance in the Argonne, it was definitely limited by their skills. Not necessarily their willingness to fight or their combat abilities of the ordinary soldier, but just generally by the level of organisation, the way in which they planned things, the expectations they had, all of those operational things that you learned by the fact that something had gone wrong despite your plan, despite what you thought was going to happen. There were 3 pillboxes on the corner of a hill and you couldn't get past them and the attack broke down, and then what do? And the British were used to that. The Americans had more to learn. And the level of preparation, how much supply you needed, where it needed to be 2 days before, 3 days before, and how far it could get during the day of fighting, that would mean you would or wouldn't have hot dinners for the troops. You know, all of those things needed to be learned. So the Americans were not available in the numbers or with the sufficient skills to drive into Germany in October of 1918. The French had gone through a massive problem in 1917, so-called mutinies of the French army, which were used by the British command to justify continuing to attack Passchendaele when actually there was no point. But that wasn't the real reason they attacked there, but that's another digression we should avoid. But it's nonetheless the case that for most of the later half of 1917, the French army was good for defence and it was not good for attack. Now, after the crisis of March 1918, when the British and French linked up and Foch becomes Supreme Commander, there's greater coordination. And Foch understands that it is possible to get the French army to attack, but only in the kind of limited attacks that could be repeated over and over again. That was the so-called bite and hold strategy, the rolling bite and hold. So what you get is each army command, both British and French, submitting plans through Haig or through Pétain, saying, we can do this. Foch would then oversee it like an umpire, agree, for example, the Fourth Army attack at Amiens. That would then go forward with an agreed date. The Germans would be pushed back. And the key to bite and hold was that you only took what you could take and that you didn't pile up loads of extra casualties by trying to push on too fast. So Foch was literally setting off each army according to a programme, each taking a turn to punch the Germans, push them back, and when the Germans had been pushed back to another line or another obstacle, that was it, stop. Get yourself ready, someone else attacks the Germans somewhere else on the front. Remember, it's a long front, so it's possible to do that. And gradually you can push everybody back. So by October 1918, the British are beginning to get close to the border between Belgium and Germany, in particular. But they're also pushing through France faster. They're also making attacks. The Sambre attack in late 1918 is a good demonstration of how even a major obstacle like the River Sambre could be crossed under opposed conditions by British troops. And whilst there's been various discussions about how well the different units did, they all got across pretty much according to their objectives. And the ones that didn't quite achieve all their objectives didn't really matter because enough had that the momentum was still being maintained, the British Army was still going forwards. But it was interesting that even then, amongst the 1st Division was amongst those taking part in that operation. Senior officers, one or two of them who were members of the House of Commons, were actually disappearing after the action at the Sambre because the negotiations, the discussions were so far forward, and therefore they needed to be back in the House of Commons because this would be overseeing the final peace treaty, well, peace agreement. I mean, it wasn't going to be a treaty at that stage, but the ultimate sort of decision to agree or not agree the armistice. So that was going on. So first thing to remember, not enough men. Then there's a political decision. How far does the British people feel it can carry on? The war was originally begun in August 1914, and whilst one shouldn't overplay the done by Christmas, will be in Berlin by Christmas kind of phraseology, nonetheless it was not expected to be a war that would still be going in 1918. So the war had passed its 4th anniversary in August, just before the Amiens offensive. So what was going to happen next? Were they going to take the British public into another winter of the war? They had been forced during 1918, late 17, due to the submarine warfare, and into 18 to increase the level of rationing. Most items were beginning to be rationed. Therefore, did the British people really want another winter of war? And that was pretty critical. There was a fundamental point. So that's another level. Were the people ready? And one of the things that challenges Nigel Farage's assessment is that when the armistice was concluded, General Wilson, who became Field Marshal and was Chief of the Imperial General Staff, was busy trying to organise the British troops that would be in the Empire, would be in the new colonies that people were expecting to be allocated to Britain by the Treaty of Versailles, etc., and Trianon, and all the others. He found he didn't have enough men. And the reason for that was that the men in the army at the end of the war wanted to go home. Now, clearly there were some long-serving men who you could let go. Clearly there might be some married men, or priority was given to minors, people like that you needed at home. But the truth was the people didn't want to be there. The men didn't want to be there. They had had enough. They'd survived the war, and even those who had been too young and gone out after the end of the war didn't want to stay. Why would they? Remember that the first year or so after the end of the fighting saw a bit of a boom in Britain. It changed up very quickly. But nonetheless, there was a feeling that you get back, get home, get back into a job, get back into employment, and therefore life would be good. And why were you stuck here in some camp, counting grave registrations like my grandfather was, or literally recycling materials from battlefields, picking up shell casings and taking them for scrap. I mean, it really wasn't something that was going to hold everybody. So that's another factor, the willingness of the British people to continue. And we know from the evidence of the soldiers after the First World War have ended with an armistice, that most of them didn't want to continue the war. So there's no reason to believe that the British public would have supported a final offensive against the Germans. The other presupposition of Mr. Farage's remark is that Britain and France could have done a push through Germany. The German army was suffering. Numbers were down, quality was down, but they did not have to fight on the Russian front anymore. They had lost their March offensive in 1918 because of some strategic errors by Ludendorff. But as you advanced into Germany, the advantages for the defenders grew and the disadvantages for the attackers increased, because you have interior lines of communication. So therefore it's possible for people to form a different defensive system. You can move your reserves around. So even if the British and French had wanted to, there would have been a growing difficulty in winning. It's also the case, and this is perhaps something that hasn't considered, is it was November. Even on the Western Front, where fighting became institutionalised year-round, there was always a drop in activity in November, December, because of the weather. And that would have been no better as you approached the German frontier or moved into German frontier than it had been before. So you wouldn't have made fast progress. And that would have meant the war dragging on probably for another year, simply because the first 3 months of your time you wouldn't have got very far anyway. The weather would have been against you. And that when you did then break through into Germany in the spring, you would have faced slow, hard going. And, perhaps it's important here to remember what happened in World War II. The push into Germany was a very hard slog. And that was with the benefit of the Russians carving the Germans up from the Eastern Front, which we didn't have in World War I. So, therefore, no easy victory, not possible to do it in 4 years and 1 month, or 2 months longer than it actually took, probably a whole year. Now, whether Mr. Farage would agree with this or not, there is also a political dimension. In 1914, Britain and France went to war with Germany alongside Russia. By 1918, Russia's out of the war, America has joined the war. The British and the French owed a huge amount of money to the Americans, and the Americans had come to be a dominant force. President Wilson's role at Versailles only emphasises that. So one of the key questions is, what sort of peace would there have been in America if America had become the driving force of the campaign in 1919, which was what was expected? And there are those who argued that one of the reasons why the political leaders opted for an armistice was that an all-out victory would have required giving the Americans even more say than they grabbed at Versailles. So you could argue that there was a less than honest answer to be given, which was that progress was not possible if you wanted to keep Britain and France at the forefront. It would have been more possible if you'd shared responses. The other thing which you would then have to bring in, though, is Wilson had got re-elected in 1916, partly on a slogan of "He kept us out of the war." So between November and April, 5 months, April 1917, he was spinning round to taking part in the war. So he faced a tough potential re-election campaign. Now, technically, he would have stepped back because he would have done the 2 terms that Washington did, and another Democrat would have stood. But any Democrat running in 1920 would have faced a very strong backlash, having taken them into the war. So the question is, would the Americans have wanted to wait longer to force a conclusion? So that's another factor to bear in mind. The other thing is that Austria had was collapsing as they negotiated with Germany. The Austrians were, they'd already put out peace feelers, and now they were just beginning to fall apart. So if you were going to see the collapse of Austria, how could you continue the war against the Germans if the Germans were prepared to make an armistice option available? So I think those are key things around which you can debate Farage's view.
So, just to round the Nigel Farage bit off, the idea that that's often been bandied around by him and others is that had something like what they call the 1919 offensive happened, the Entente could have stopped Hitler from ever coming to power. What would be your thoughts on the idea of this being the sort of mistake in stopping some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century?
Well, obviously no one would want to have had the Hitler regime come to power and the appalling devastation of Germany, the Holocaust, with its brutal attempt to exterminate the Jews, etc. None of that one would want to see, and therefore people might say, well, here's a way of avoiding it. I think the difficulty is that there are a lot of other factors involved. The first one was the lack of openness in German society. When the war ended, there was a move by the German army and the German elite to protect their position in German society. And having fostered revolution in Russia, they were extremely keen to avoid that happening in Germany. And the Gröner-Eber Pact was effectively a pledge by the army to back a moderate socialist government to avoid any sense in which there would be a left-wing revolution. So one of the reasons why Hitler can come to power is that German society had been conditioned by the retention of power of the German elite. For example, Georgi Leithart, who presided over Hitler's trial, was in fact a considerably right-wing judge who had survived from the Imperial German period. So people like him were able to exercise power in a way which then fostered the potential for a rise of Hitler. If Hitler had been shot for treason in 1923, then you can make a very strong argument that he wouldn't have come to power. And although it's easy to argue that there would have been someone else, I think the combination of things that we see after 1933 has a strong element which is personal to the priorities of Hitler, the individual. So that's the first thing. They manipulated the truth and they made sure that the military and political elite of Germany remained as intact as it could in the circumstances. I mean, you've only got to remember that the Kaiser went into exile, was sent to Holland, retained his money, retained his connections. He obviously had many times hoped to come back. So that factor is one which would have made it difficult for this thesis that everything would have been all right. I think the other thing is that it's about what happens next. You know, one of the key things to remember, one of the key statistics to remember, is the tiny vote that the Nazis achieved in 1928. They were seen as a virulent, power-hungry group of individuals who had no real relevance. You know, they were attacking the foreigners, blaming them for everything, and they were getting nowhere in terms of politics. If it hadn't have been for the Weimar system with pure PR, they wouldn't have had any MPs because they had some MPs, they had some income, but you know, that was all that was keeping them afloat, was their tiny, tiny representation in the Reichstag. But by 1933 Hitler's in power, and therefore the economic crash of 1929 has a huge part to play in bringing Hitler to power. You know, from political isolation in the wilderness, 1928, 1932, largest single party in Germany. So there's a huge change following the way in which the crash impacted on Germany. One of the key things there to bear in mind is that there had been a huge flood of money into Germany. Lots of American loans, lots of American banking institutions had provided loans to Germany. Then in 1927-28, there began to be a change in their appraisal of the German market. And in 1927, as these reappraisals began to take place, there was a growing trend towards shortening the terms of loans to German banks. So in 1928, the banks started to renew their loans, but renew them on shorter terms. And so when the crash came in 1929, American banks, looking to liquidate loans in order to generate cash, started by terminating loans to Germany. That meant that there was a rapid rise in unemployment. So when the Americans talk about, you know, they sneezed and Europe caught a cold, it's an exaggeration because, first of all, it was Germany that caught a cold. If you look at French economic activity, it doesn't really impact there till about 1936. It's quite slow. So there's a very different approach depending on where the money lay. And in this case, the German banks were finding themselves having to repay loans to the American banks. Therefore, they were calling in loans in Germany. Therefore, businesses went bust. And the difficulty, as always in those circumstances, is that, if the person who's manufacturing and selling hoovers in Germany gets their loan withdrawn, then it's not just they who lose out, it's their workers who lose out, it's the people, the traditional sort of thing of, the people on the way to the factory stopping to buy a newspaper or whatever, that shop then has no customers coming past it every morning. So you get this vicious spiral of unemployment breeding further unemployment. Then, if you look at the German system, which was not untypical, after 2 years you lost your benefits. You've been social insurance, you got that for 2 years, the expectation was you get a job. Given a situation of mass unemployment, over that 2-year period between sort of early 1930, when a lot of the jobs are lost, through to early 32, people are running out of benefit. If you haven't got any benefit, you start to get desperate. You start to think, I haven't got a job, I've got no money, I've had 2 years of this, and then you turn to someone who appears to be doing something about it. And you see the rise of the Nazi vote, you see it rising and rising because people are desperate, they want solutions. And Hitler's offering a very easy solution. All the blame lies with foreigners or Jews, and Jews are seen as outsiders, so it's like your internal foreigner. So he's offering a very simple message. It's not your fault. And we can do something better. We can start spending money, we can rearm, we can do things. And it's very interesting because the rise in the Nazi vote stalls late 1932 when Schleicher, as the Chancellor, tries to increase work. So he spends time converting barracks to housing and various things like that, which generate lots of jobs. And the Nazi vote peaks. Now, Schleicher is then undermined by von Papen, and von Papen brings Hitler into power with Hindenburg's approval. But nonetheless, Schleicher was offering something practical, and an awful lot of Germans began to think this was better. So it stalled the Nazi vote. Now, when Schleicher's removed, and therefore the programmes are not continued, or they're not continued again until Hitler comes to power, it looks like there is no support, no way out, that the people are in a difficult situation. So what should they do? Well, simple. Vote for a person who's promising you solutions. Easy solutions. Now, that's the difficult bit, isn't it? Because without the economic crash, there would probably have been no Nazi rise to power. Now, there are other factors that bring them to power, the machinations between von Papen and Schleicher, and Hindenburg's position about being anti-socialist. If you take all those things together, Hitler comes to power for a whole set of reasons, not just the economic crash, not just the Treaty of Versailles, but coming together, they all bring him to power. So that's why I would argue that you shouldn't link Hitler coming to power just with the Versailles Treaty, and therefore not just with why didn't we have an all-out victory.
And just to sort of round things off, because there are those historians who might delve into the sort of alternate history area of the fiction writer or artist when it comes to seeing, like, evaluating factors with what some call playing what if and others call counterfactual history. Do you have any thoughts on this historical/historiographical technique?
I think if you do history properly, then counterfactual history has a role, but it only really has a role in challenging assumptions. So if you said, for example, I'll take the Robert Harris book, Fatherland, he comes up with 3 things that prevent the Germans beating the Russians, but prevent the other side beating the Germans. So the German regime survives. Other countries remain in existence, but nonetheless the Nazis continue in power. And if you do it that way, you can then make a story about what it might have been like if they hadn't fallen, because you've set it up on some sort of valid premise that allows you to make those arguments. But I think as a traditional historian, I tend to see counterfactual history as just that. You want to challenge something, you think it'd be more interesting to write about this, and to a certain extent there's no harm done, but I do think that the key is to look at dimensions. What is it that's going on? What is it that means that you can't just put one explanation to one thing, because so rarely is that going to be the case. And unless you make it something very, very specific. If you look at the debate they've had over the origins of the Holocaust alone, you can see that even when you make it something as specific as Hitler, final solution, people are going, well, yes, but there's this factor, that factor, and the other factor. All right? It doesn't deny the Holocaust happened. It doesn't deny that it was brutal and systemic, and that it was all about the extermination of a race. Doesn't take any of that away, but there is a discussion. Is it because Hitler wanted it to happen? Is it because Goering was in a power play with Himmler? Is it because they were also disorganised, that they couldn't manage to get things properly done? Or there's all various things, all of which still leave intact the truth of the Holocaust. But, and this is the key thing, I think, counterfactual history can be useful in challenging assumptions. So, for example, what if the Americans had decided to form an economic alliance with Japan in the 1920s and 30s? What would that have done to international relations? If Mussolini's invasion of Abyssinia had been approved of by the great powers, as it was in the Hall of Alpact, and not leaked out to the public, would Mussolini have simply joined the Allied side and not ended up with Hitler? You can make some interesting comments about that, but you're still having to focus on the very clear, to do really good counterfactual questions, you actually have to work out very clearly which were the crucial steps. And I think, to go back to the original question, Nigel Farage was looking back at a period of British history where he wanted to blame the establishment for what was wrong in Britain. That's his big message to people. If you leave the establishment in charge, they suit themselves, and it suited them in October 1918 to stop the war. So, by early November the negotiations are underway. I think that's too simplistic, because it doesn't recognise that it wasn't just the establishment making that decision, albeit they were the decision makers. They were operating in a very, very highly strained social context, one which probably didn't allow for people to go forward.
Well, thank you for joining us on the programme, and thank you to Millie and Alfie for your kind cooperation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been really enjoyable to share some ideas with you.
Well, that was a very interesting talk from Dr Simon Peaple, and hope you enjoyed it. I did, and it was an interesting way of looking at history and the questions of counterfactuality in it. And it was lovely having you here.